Recently, in the comments of a few of my videos, I have been asked to talk about my favorite video games of each generation of PlayStation. To make sure that this video is not way too long, I plan to talk about each generation of PlayStation in their own separate videos. Today we're going to talk about the very first PlayStation. Now I want to make one thing clear right from the start. All of the games I'm talking about today are only games that I own, at one point owned, played, or beaten. If I do not talk about a game that you love, that does not belittle those games because everybody has their own favorites. If you have not already, please like this video, leave a comment about your favorite PlayStation 1 games, as well as your own memories of playing PlayStation 1 games, and subscribe for more video game content. The early years of PlayStation were filled with many great games, but by far some of the best games were skateboarding games. There were very few people who did not play the Tony Hawk's games, and even if we did not have the ability to skateboard in real life ourselves, we lived our dreams through the video games. One of the best of those games for PlayStation was that of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2. Pro Skater 2 used the same engine as its previous installment, but improved the game's graphics and gameplay, as well as having a killer punk rock and hip-hop soundtrack. The game allowed you to take control of a variety of skateboarders. From there, you had to rather perform skateboarding tricks or collect certain objects throughout the level. The career mode was the main game mode, which showcased many different levels from schools, hangars, New York City, Philadelphia, and many more. For each level, you had 10 objectives, which would increase in difficulty as you moved from one level to the next. Objectives range from getting the highest score to collecting skate or jumping difficult jumps. There were other single-player levels you could do, like free skating and single session. There was also a multiplayer mode that had 5 game types, including graffiti, trick attack, tag, horse, and free skate. One of the best modes, though, was the ability to create your own levels in Level Editor. You could take 100 pieces and a variety of pre-built park bases, and this was one of the funnest things about the game because you could design your own levels and be able to play the levels you created and share them with your friends. The skaters in the game were from real-life professional skateboarders, including Bob Burnquist, Tony Hawk, Rodney Mullen, and many more. And of course, probably the coolest skateboarder was Spiderman, who was added based on a licensing deal with the company who made the game and Marvel Comics. This game brings back so many good memories of taking turns with my brother and our cousins trying to outdo the other by getting higher scores or finishing the levels the quickest. It was just a lot of fun, and it was a game that was easy to pick up and play. Another popular series growing up was Yu-Gi-Oh! It was a trading card game, a manga, an anime, and of course it had video games as well. And one of those games was Yu-Gi-Oh! Forbidden Memories. The game itself was loosely based on the series and its characters. If you've ever played the trading card game, you pretty much understand the majority of the rules. Though the game had a lot of similarities to the TCG, it differed in a lot of areas, which early games in the series were most famous for doing this. There was no sacrificing and can summon all monsters regardless of level. You drew to 5 cards every turn, and probably the most unique element of the game was fusions. Fusions typically require a spell card called polymerization, but in this game you could fuse as many cards as you wanted together, even in your entire hand. Monsters also got special symbols like Mercury, Sun, Moon, Venus, etc. These gave them an increased power against certain monsters who had the opposite symbols, and it would help defeat higher powered monsters. The story was also unique because it focused on Yugi and Adam as they worked together to take down an Egyptian evil ruler named Haitian who controlled the dark power. Throughout the entire game, you were tasked with collecting all the Millennium items to take down Haitian and the monster he is trying to summon named Nightmare. Later on the PS2, we were introduced to a sequel to this game called Duelist of the Roses, which is yet another game that takes the series' TCG rules and changes the formula up. The early Yu-Gi-Oh! Games were unique and had many amazing gameplay mechanics that are fun to play. Forbidden Memories was the first Yu-Gi-Oh! Game that I played growing up, and I spent over 100 hours with this game, and it is very nostalgic to me. Our next game is Top Shop. It's probably one of the few games on this list that many of you have never heard of or even knew existed, but is by far one of the best games on the system. In Top Shop, it mimics several of the gameplay elements of the board game Monopoly. This game can be played by yourself with random CPUs, or you can play with your friends and compete with each other. Just like Monopoly, this game could take forever to end and can be played for multiple hours. In Top Shop, players will play across a game board that you have to move based on the roll of a dice. You will purchase unowned properties, and when you make it to the bank, you earn money. The reason for buying properties in Top Shop is different from Monopoly, in that in Monopoly, people who land on your property are forced to pay rent, but in Top Shop, people who land on your property must buy an item from the shop you own. Items in the shop cost varying levels of money, and items bought will disappear, and owners of the shop will have to restock, because if they run out of items, it can be the store itself can be bought by other players. All products bought give cash back to the player who owned that store. The game has a lot of strategy elements to it because you can buy special events that can change the game up a bit, as well as maximizing your store's capacity by buying neighboring properties and expanding the store. The game features 8 unique maps, 11 characters, and 44 different shops. There is a story mode and a free play mode inside the game. This was a game that I discovered from one of my best friends, and several times that we played this game, we would stay up till almost 4 in the morning. I currently do not own a copy of this game, but when I do find a copy of this game, again, I will be buying it for myself immediately. The next game is another hidden gem on the PlayStation 1 that many of you have never played or even heard of, and randomly I found it as a child. That game was Jade Cocoon's Story of the Tamamamu. It is a role-playing RPG game that combines itself with a virtual pet management game. The game Jade Cocoon is set in the world where most of the land is surrounded by dense forests that are populated by bizarre, mostly bug-like monsters called minions. In the game, you play as Levant, who is a young cocoon master whose job is to capture minions and purify them. As you capture them by fighting, you can fuse them together to make even more powerful combinations. When fusing them together, you take on the different physical characteristics of the parent creatures to combine into new inventions. Each minion has a collection of elemental attacks, and the battle strategy is broken down to a simple rock, paper, scissors pattern. You use minions to help during battle, and it adds a new depth to the game. This game has a lot of qualities of Pokemon along with qualities of Final Fantasy. This was probably my first real introduction to RPG games outside of Pokemon, and before I had even knew what Final Fantasy was, I had played this hidden gem. The fusing for me was my favorite part because I just wanted to know what creature combinations I could make and what amazing new partners I could take with me to fight against the other minions that I would come across. The story was also pretty great, and it had me wanting to know what was happening next. But really, the gameplay itself is what kept me coming back for more and finding out what fusions I can make, and it was just such a fun game to play back on the PlayStation 1. Some of the greatest survival horror game series that has ever been made their first appearance on the PlayStation 1. One of those series was Silent Hill. Silent Hill uses a third-person view, and due to the limitations of graphics of the console, they used fog and darkness to muddle the graphics. But even if it was just because of the graphical limitations that it made it easier to do that, it made the game so much more terrifying, and it gave us an amazing atmosphere to travel through. Unlike other survival horror games of its time, the protagonist of Silent Hill is not a combat-trained individual, and instead is your everyday citizen. If you've never played the game before, here's a little background. You play as Henry Mason, who has found himself in the monsters-filled town of Silent Hill, looking for his missing daughter Cheryl. Along the way, he comes across a multitude of monstrous entities that he does not know anything about and is stuck in his own nightmare trying to find his lost daughter. The gameplay consists of combat, puzzle solving, and exploration. The camera is normally third person but can change the angle for dramatic effect depending on the area. There are no displays on screen, so you have to check the health of the character in the separate menu. If you had a DualShock controller, you could feel the heartbeat in the controller to showcase how low the health was for your character. The combat is similar in many ways to Resident Evil, and it had tank controls as well. The major difference in this game compared to Resident Evil is the lack of skill your protagonist has. The protagonist uses weapons such as melee weapons and firearms, but when using firearms, because of the inexperience of the main character, it means that your aiming and targeting of your enemies was so much more unstable. Your character also had a radio that helped alert you when nearby creatures were present by making static sounds. This was very helpful in progressing through the story. Outside of the gameplay, the atmosphere is terrifying, and the fear of the unknown makes this game even scarier. The game also featured many different endings, which made the game fun to replay to experience what other endings there were in the game. And the endings were always based on the player's previous choices. I enjoyed this game so much, and playing it with my brother and solving the puzzles and scaring ourselves silly was what made me love this game growing up, and is a horror game masterpiece. We really need this game ported onto the current gen's consoles, at least on the PlayStation Plus for the classic games. If you're looking for one of the best 3D platformers on PlayStation, then obviously you'll want to play Insomniac Games' Spyro the Dragon. Nowadays, Insomniac Games has been making games such as Spiderman and the Ratchet & Clank game series, but one of my favorite games they had ever made was early on the PlayStation with Spyro the Dragon. Spyro the Dragon is about a young purple dragon who him and his dragonfly friend Sparks are journeying across the Dragon Kingdom to defeat nasty Nork and save the trapped dragons. The game is an open-ended 3D platformer that features large sprawling levels and the players making choices of what to do first. Each level has collectible items such as gemstones, crystallized dragons, and stolen dragon eggs. Playing as Spyro, you can use abilities such as breathing fire, charging attacks, and midair glides. Each level also has boss battles that are fun and memorable. Not just that, but this game was so successful that it warranted 2 sequels on the PlayStation 1 and so many more across the PlayStation 2 and other systems. Spyro is an iconic character that has been around since PlayStation 1, and for many, it was one of the early mascots. Now, of course, it's owned by Activision, and with the new purchase, it is now a property of Xbox. But recently, this game, among all the other original games for PlayStation 1, has been remade as part of the Spyro Reignited trilogy, and it's an amazing adaptation worth checking out if you do not own a PlayStation 1. It's available on PlayStation 4 right now. We mentioned earlier when talking about Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 that the developers of Neversoft had rights to Marvel Comics for gaming, and they made a Spider-Man game using that same engine that they used for Pro Skater 2. This was among a handful of games that I got when I first bought my PlayStation 1. Growing up, I loved Spider-Man comics and the animated series, and this game was a dream come true to play. The game made me feel like Spider-Man, and I got to face some of the most dangerous villains of his rogues gallery, such as Dr. Octavius, Carnage, Scorpion, Rhino, Venom, and Mysterio. Spider-Man also featured the exclusive villain created for the game, Monster Ock, which was the final boss and one of the coolest bosses in the game. Spider-Man was fantastic and even featured narration by Stan Lee. The gameplay has you using Spider-Man's powers of web slinging, crawling on walls, web shooters, and much more. You cannot fall off the buildings on the game or you would die because of the toxin that has been released into New York City. So you had to stay up on top of the buildings throughout the level, and so you had to make sure that you kept swinging and did not fall. You would fight random enemies along the way, and eventually leading to boss fights in certain levels. Each level you are going from a point A to point B or completing some specific objective. Throughout the game you can also find comics, which unlock Spider-Man's comic book issue covers for the main menu to look at. You could also find power-ups such as spider armor in the levels as well. The story focused on Dr. Otto Octavius and Mysterio setting up Spider-Man to look like a bad guy for stealing equipment from a science expo. From there, you are stopped along the way by different villains as you're trying to learn more about who framed you. Some of the voice actors from the Spider-Man and Spider-Man Unlimited cartoons would reprise their roles, including Rhino Ramono as Spider-Man. This game spawned 3 sequels, including 2 spin-offs for the Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance, and the eventual true sequel to the game in Spider-Man 2 and Enter Electro, which was exclusive to PlayStation. This was the best Spider-Man game, in my opinion, until we got Insomniac Games' version for the PS4. And as recent as April 2022, there has been conversations from the original game developer about remastering the game. Who knows if this will happen, but as a fan, it has truly got my hopes up that we will get to see this game again soon, and hopefully, at the least, on the PlayStation Plus premium subscription. No, the last 2 games that I'm going to talk about are by far the greatest games that have been released on PlayStation 1 in my own opinion. These games have been favorites of mine since I was little and love them just as much today, and both games have been remade in recent years. And the first game we're going to talk about is Resident Evil 2. Resident Evil 2 was released in 1998 as a survival horror game. The Resident Evil franchise has been running strong with many spin-offs, and we recently had the 8th game in its installment. Resident Evil 2 also has a remake that released back in 2019 is one of the best games currently in the PlayStation 4 era. The game is set 2 months after the original and stars 2 brand new characters, Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield, the sister of Chris Redfield. The gameplay is the same as the first, where you are exploring areas of the game, solving puzzles, and fighting zombies and other monstrous beings. You are limited in ammo, and you will have to be tactical about how much you use and how to make it through the level without wasting too much ammo. You also have healing items you can pick up, and the more damage that you have been dealt, the slower your character will move. Having some way to heal yourself is very important. The only safe places in the game is in save rooms, where you have a box to store items and a typewriter that will allow you to save the game. The game is scary, the story is fantastic, and it has some boss fights that are hard at times, and the puzzles are fun as well. The game also has tank controls, which we mentioned earlier with Silent Hill, which basically means that you have to press up to move forward, down to reverse, and left and right to rotate. The game is very hard to play today, but it was pretty much the standard controls for horror games such as Resident Evil and Silent Hill. Horror games are amazing, and by far Resident Evil as a series is one of my favorites, and nothing to me beats the scares, puzzles, bosses, and the story of Resident Evil 2, especially on the PlayStation 1. The remake is also fantastic and brings the game to new life on the PS4, and it is worth playing both versions today. I will also say that I love Resident Evil, the first game in the series that was also released on the PlayStation 1, and both games are worth playing and some of the best games of that generation. There is actually currently a director's cut of the first Resident Evil game on PlayStation Plus Premium right now, so you should probably check that out. And we have finally made it to my personal #1 best game selected for the PlayStation 1, and that is Final Fantasy VII. It is one of the best JRPG games that I have ever played. This game had not only a fun battle system and a unique world to explore, but also had some of my favorite characters that has ever been created for a video game. The game has a world map that you use to explore larger areas of the game, and then you have a specific field that you will enter that has you roaming around, fighting random enemies, as well as talking to people and doing side objectives. Final Fantasy VII is a traditional JRPG that has you using magic, swords, and etc. to do damage to a variety of enemies, as well as a powerful finisher style move called limit breaks. Each character in combat uses an active time system that has you attacking your enemies attacking until one side has been defeated. Final Fantasy VII has had many games added to the series, from spin-offs to a movie. We've even got a full remake in 2020, and we have even more games in the remake series coming out over the next few years. This series is one of the most popular game franchises and has some of the greatest characters, and is overall has some of the best gameplay. It is one of the JRPGs that I had the most fun playing growing up, and I could not imagine having a PlayStation 1 without this game. I would say more about the story, but honestly, I would not want to spoil anything about this game because it is best enjoyed by playing it yourself. Final Fantasy VII is a decently long game, but well worth the time put into it. If you love Final Fantasy VII, you will also find enjoyment in the Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy IX games that are also on the PlayStation 1. All three games are amazing PlayStation 1 titles and are some of the most fun games to play. You can play all three games on PlayStation 4 and PS5 through the PlayStation Plus Premium service. Take my word for it and play these games as soon as possible. 7 will always be my favorite of the mainline games, no matter what, but all the Final Fantasy games are worth checking out. Well, that is all 9 PlayStation 1 games that I've talked about today, and they are some of the best games that I have ever played growing up. There are many games I did not talk about, but that does not mean that the games that I did not mention aren't good. If you have games on the PlayStation 1 that you love that I did not talk about in today's video, please talk about those games below in the comments, along with your favorite PlayStation 1 memories. Hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'm going to get back to playing some games as well. Check back soon because we will be talking about the PlayStation 2, PS3, PS4, and PS5's best games as well. Thank you all. See you all next time.